Welcome back. In this segment, we are continuing our trek through history, the history of Protestantism. This series is being posted daily on FirstAmendmentRadio.net Rumble channel, and quite an exciting history. I'm glad to be reading it again, and this time recording it for you all. And we're about, perhaps halfway through Volume 1 at this point. So we're going to be at it for a while since there are 5 volumes in this series. Where we left off last time, we were in Book 5th, The History of Protestantism in Germany, to the Leipsic Disputation. Of course, we're looking at the beginning of Martin Luther's history here, and we're in chapter 1 of that, so we've just begun that, and Luther's birth, childhood, and school days. And so I'm just going to pick up right where we left off. 3 great princes occupied the 3 leading thrones of Europe. To these we may add the potentate of the Vatican, in some points the least, but in others the greatest of the 4. The conflicting interests and passions of these 4 great men preserved a sort of balance, and restrained the tempests of war from ravaging Christendom. The long and bloody conflicts which had devastated Germany were ended as the 15th century drew to its close. The sword rested, meanwhile, in Europe. As in the Roman world, the wars of centuries were concluded, and the doors of the temple of Janus were shut, when a great birth was to take place, and a new era to open. So was it once again at the beginning of the 16th century. Protestantism was about to step upon the stage, and to proclaim the good news of the recovery of the long-lost gospel. And on all sides, from the Carpathians to the Atlantic, there was comparative quiet, so that the nations might be able to hear the blessed tidings. It was then that Luther was born. First of the father. His name was John Luther. His family was an old one, and had dwelt in these parts a long while. The patrimonial inheritance was gone, and without estate or title, rich only in the superior qualities of his mind, John Luther earned his daily bread by his daily labor. There is more of dignity in honest labor than in entitled idleness. This man married a daughter of one of the villagers of Neustadt, Margaret Lindman by name. At the period of their marriage, they lived near Eisenach, a romantic town at the foot of the Wartburg, with the glades of the Thuringia forest around it. Soon after their marriage, they left Eisenach and went to live at Eisleben, a town nearby belonging to the Counts of Mansfield. They were a worthy pair, and, though humble in condition, greatly respected. John Luther, the father of the Reformer, was a fearer of God, very upright in his dealings and very diligent in his business. He was marked by his good sense, his manly bearing, and the firmness with which he held by his opinions. What was rare in that age, he was a lover of books. Books then were scarce, and consequently dear, and John Luther had not much money to spend on their purchase, nor much time to read those he was able to buy. Still the miner, for he was a miner by trade, managed to get a few, which he read at meal times, or in the calm German evenings, after his return from his work. Margaret Lindman, the mother of Luther, was a woman of superior mind and character. She was a peasant by birth, as we have said, but she was truly pious, and piety lends a grace to humble station, which is often wanting in lofty rank. The fear of God gives a refinement to the sentiments, and a delicacy and grace to the manners, more fascinating by far than any conventional ease or airs which a coronet can bestow. The purity of the soul shining through the face lends its beauty, even as the lamp transmits its radiance through the alabaster vase and enhances its symmetry. Margaret Lindman was looked up to by all her neighbors, who regarded her as a pattern to be followed for her good sense, her household economy, and her virtue. To this worthy couple, both much given to prayer, there was born a son on the 10th of November, 1483. He was their firstborn, and as the 10th of November is St. Martin's Eve, they called their son Martin. Thus was ushered into the world the future reformer. When a prince is born, bells are rung, cannons are discharged, and a nation's congratulations are carried to the foot of the throne. What rejoicings and splendors around the cradle where lies the heir of some great empire. When God sends his heroes into the world, there are no such ceremonies. They step quietly upon the stage where they are to act their great part. Like that kingdom of which they are the heralds and champions, their coming is not with observation. Let us visit the cottage of John Luther of Eisleben on the evening of November 10th, 1483. There slumbers the miner's firstborn. The miner and his wife are proud of their babe, no doubt, but the child is just like other German children. There is no indication about it of the wondrous future that awaits the child that has come into existence in this lowly household. When he grows up, he will toil doubtless with his father as a miner. Had the Pope, Sixtus IV, was then reigning, looked in upon the child, and marked how lowly was the cot in which he lay, and how entirely absent were all signs of worldly power and wealth, he would have asked with disdain, can any harm to the popedom come from this child? Can any danger to the chair of Peter, that seat more august than the throne of kings, lurk in this poor dwelling? Or if the emperor had chanced to pass that way, and had learned that there was born a son to John Luther the miner, well, what of that? He would have asked. There is one child more in Germany, that is all. He may one day be a soldier in my ranks, who knows, and help to fight my battles. How greatly would these potentates, looking only at things seen, and believing only in material forces, have miscalculated. The miner's child was become mightier than the Pope, mightier than emperor. One Luther was stronger than all the cardinals of Rome, than all the legions of the empire. His voice was to shake the popedom, and his strong hands were to pull down its pillars, that a new edifice might be erected in its room. Again it might be said, as at the birth of a yet greater child, he has scattered the proud in the imagination of their hearts. He hath put down the mighty from their seats, and exalted them of low degree. When Martin was 6 months old, his parents removed to Mansfield. At that time the portion of this world's goods which his father possessed was small indeed, but the mines of Mansfield were lucrative. John Luther was industrious, and by his business began to thrive, and his table was better spread. He was now the owner of 2 furnaces. He became in time a member of the town council, and was able to gratify his taste for knowledge by entertaining at times the more learned among the clergy of his neighborhood, and the conversation that passed had doubtless its influence upon the mind of a boy of so quick parts as the young Martin. The child grew, and might now be seen playing with the other children of Mansfield on the banks of the Whipper. His home was happier than it had been. His health was good, his spirits buoyant, and his clear, joyous voice rang out above those of his playmates. But there was a cross in his lot even then. It was a stern age. John Luther, with all his excellence, was a somewhat austere man. As a father, he was a strict disciplinarian. No fault of the son went unpunished, and not unfrequently was the chastisement in excess of the fault. This severity was not wise. A nature less elastic than Luther's would have sunk under it into sullenness, or it may be hardened into wickedness. But what the Father on earth did for his own pleasure, or from mistaken sense of duty, the Father in heaven overruled for the lasting good of the future reformer. It is good for a man to bear the yoke in his youth. For it is in youth, sometimes even in childhood, that the great turning points of life occur. Luther's nature was one of strong impulses. These forces were all indeed in his future work, but had they not been disciplined and brought under control, they might have made him rash, impetuous, and headlong. Therefore he was early taught to submit to the curb. His nature, moreover, rich in the finest sensibilities, might, but for this discipline, have become self-indulgent. Turning away from the harder tasks of life, Luther might have laid himself out only to enjoy the good within his reach, had not the hardships and severities of his youth tempered his character, and imported into it that element of hardness which was necessary for the greater trials before him. Besides the examples of piety which he daily beheld, Luther received a little rudimental instruction under the domestic roof. By and by he was sent to school at Mansfield. He was yet a little one, to use Melancthon's phrase, so young indeed that his father sometimes carried him to school on his shoulders. The thought that his son would one day be a scholar cheered John Luther in his labors, and the hope was strengthened by the retentive memory, the sound understanding, and the power of application which the young Luther already displayed. At the age of 1497, Martin was sent to the Franciscan school at Magdeburg. At school, the hardships and privations amid which his childhood had been passed not only attended him, but increased. His master often flogged him, for it was a maxim of those days that nothing could be learned without the free use of the rod, and we can imagine that the buoyant or boisterous nature of the boy often led him into transgressions of the rules of the school etiquette. He mentions having one day been flogged 15 times. What added to his hardships was the custom then universal in the German towns, and continued until a recent date, if even now wholly abandoned, of the scholars begging their bread, in addition to the task of conning their lessons. They went in small companies, ringing from door to door, and receiving whatever alms the good burghers were pleased to give them. At times it would happen that they received more blows, or at least more rebuffs, than alms. The instruction was gratis, but the young scholar had not bread to eat, and though the means of his father were ampler than before, all were needed for the support of his family, now numerous. And after a year Luther was withdrawn from Magdeburg and sent to a school in Eisenach, where, having relatives, he would have less difficulty, it was thought, in supporting himself. These hopes were not realized, because perhaps his relations were poor. The young scholar still had to earn his meals by singing in the streets. One day Luther was perambulating Eisenach, stopping before his likeliest dwellings and striving with a brief hymn to woo the inmates to kindness. He was sore pressed with hunger, but no door opened, and no hand was extended to him. He was greatly downcast. He stood musing with himself what should become of him. Alas, he could not endure these hardships much longer. He must abandon his studies. He must return home and work with his father in the mines. It was at this moment that Providence opened a home for him. As he stood absorbed in these melancholy thoughts, a door near him was open, and a voice bade him come in. He turned to see who it was that spoke to him. It was Ursula, the wife of Conrad Cotta, a man of consideration among the burghers of Eisenach. Ursula Cotta had marked the young scholar before. He was accustomed to sing in the church choir on Sundays. She had been struck with the sweetness of his voice. She had heard the harsh words with which he had been driven away from other doors. Taking pity, she took him in, and made him sit down at her board. And not only did she appease his hunger for the time, but her husband won by the open face and sweet disposition of the boy, made him come and live with them. Luther now had a home. He could eat without begging or singing for his bread. He had found a father and mother in this worthy pair. His heart open, his young genius grew livelier and lovelier every day. Penury, like the chill of winter, had threatened to blight his powers in the bud. But this kindness, like the sun, with genial warmth, awakened them into new vigor. He gave himself to study with fresh ardor. Tasks difficult before became easy now. If his voice was less frequently heard in the streets, it cheered the dwelling of his adopted parents. Madame Cotta was fond of music, and in what way could the young scholar so well repay her kindness as by cultivating his talent for singing and exercising it for the delight of this good Shunammite? Luther passed, after this, nearly 2 years at Eisenach, equally happy at school, in the study of Latin, rhetoric, and verse-making, and at home, where his hours of leisure were filled up with song, in which he was not unfrequently accompanied himself on the lute. He never afterward forgot either Eisenach or the good Madame Cotta. He was accustomed to speak of the former as his own beautiful town, and with reference to the latter he would say, "There's nothing kinder than a good woman's heart." The incident helped also to strengthen his trust in God, when greater perils threatened his future career, when man stood aloof, and he could descry no deliverance near. He remembered his agony in the streets of Eisenach, and how visibly God had come to his help. We cannot but mark the wisdom of God in the training of the future reformer. By nature he was loving and trustful, with a heart ever yearning for human sympathy, and a mind ever planning largely for the happiness of others. But this was not enough. These qualities must be tempered by others, which should enable him to confront opposition, endure reproach, despise ease, and brave peril. The first, without the last, would have issued in mere benevolent scheming, and Luther would have died sighing over the stupidity or malignity of those who had thwarted his philanthropic projects. He would have instead abandoned his plans on the first appearance of opposition and said, "Well, if the world won't be reformed, I shall let it alone." Luther, on the other hand, reckoned on meeting this opposition. He was trained to endure and bear with it. And in his early life we see the hardening and the expanding process going on by turns. And so it is with all whom God selects for rendering great services to the church or to the world. He sends them to hard school. He keeps them in it until their education is complete. Let us mark the eagle and the bird of song, how dissimilar their rearing. The one is to spend its life in the groves, flitting from bough to bough, and enlivening the woods with its melody. Look what a warm nest it lies in. The thick branches cover it, and its dam sits brooding over it. How differently is the eaglet nursed, on yonder ledge, amid the naked crags, open to the lashing rain, and the pelting hail, and the stormy gusts. Are spread on the bare rock a few twigs. These are the nest of that bird which is to spend its later life in soaring among the clouds, battling with the winds, and gazing upon the sun. Luther was to spend his life in conflict with emperors and popes, and the powers of temporal and spiritual despotism. Therefore his cradle was placed in a miner's cot, and his childhood and youth were passed amid hardship and peril. It was thus he came to know that man lives not to enjoy, but to achieve, and that to achieve anything great he must sacrifice himself, turn away from man, and lean only on God. Chapter 2. Luther's College Life. Erfurt, City and University. Studies, Aquinas and etc. Cicero and Virgil. A Bible. Bachelor of Arts, Doctor of Philosophy, Illness, Conscience Awakens, Visits his parents, Thunderstorm, his vow, Farewell supper to his friends, Enters a monastery. In 1501, Luther entered the University of Erfurt. He had now attained the age of 18 years. His seat of learning had been founded about a century before. It owed its rise to the patronage of the princely houses of Brunswick and Saxony, and it had already become one of the more famous schools of Central Europe. Erfurt is an ancient town, journeying from Eisenach eastward along the Thuringian plain. It makes an imposing show as its steeples, cathedral towers, and ramparts rise before the eye of the traveler. Thirsting for knowledge, the young scholar came hither to drink his fill. His father wished him to study law, not doubting that with his great talents he would speedily achieve eminence and fill some post of emolument and dignity in the civic administration of his country. In this hope, John Luther toiled harder than ever, that he might support his son more liberally than heretofore. At Erfurt, new studies engaged the attention of Luther. The scholastic philosophy was still in great repute. Aristotle, the humbler but still mighty names of Aquinas, Bones, Occam, and others were the great sovereigns of the schools. So had the verdict of ages pronounced, although the time was now near when that verdict would be reversed, and the darkness of oblivion would quench those lights placed, as was supposed, eternally in the firmament for the guidance of mankind. The young man threw himself with avidity upon this branch of study. It was an attempt to gather grapes of thorns and figs of thistles, yet Luther profited by the effort, for the Aristotelian philosophy had some redeeming virtues. It was radically hostile to the true method of acquiring knowledge, afterwards laid open by Bacon. Yet it tried the strength of the faculties, and the discipline to which it subjected them was beneficial in proportion as it was stringent. Not only did it minister to the ripening of the logical understanding, it gave an agility of mind, a keenness of discrimination, a dialectic skill, and a nicety of fence which were of the greatest value in the discussion of subtle questions. In these studies Luther forged the weapon which he was to wield with such terrible effect in the combats of his greater life. 2 years of his university course were passed. From the thorny yet profitable paths of the scholastics he would turn aside at times to regale himself in the greener and richer fields open to him in the orations of Cicero and the lays of Virgil. What he most studied to master was not the words, but the thinking of the ancients. It was their wisdom which he wished to garner up. His progress was great. He became par excellence the scholar of Erfurt. It was now that an event occurred that changed the whole future of the life of the young student. Fond of books like his father, he went day by day to the library of the university and spent some hours amid its treasures. He was now 20 years of age, and he reveled in the riches round him. One day, as he took down books from their shelves and opened them one after another, he came to a volume unlike all the others. Taking it from its place, he opened it, and to his surprise he found that it was a Bible, the Vulgate, or Latin translation of the Holy Scriptures by Jerome. The Bible he had never seen until now. His joy was great. There are certain portions which the Church prescribes to be read in public on Sunday and Saint days, and Luther imagined that these were the whole Bible. His surprise was great when, on opening this volume, he found in it whole books and epistles of which he had never before heard. He began to read with the feelings of one whom the heavens have been opened. The part of the book which he read was the story of Samuel, dedicated to the Lord from his childhood by his mother, growing up in the temple, and becoming the witness of the wickedness of Eli's sons, the priests of the Lord, who made the people to transgress and to abhor the offering of the Lord. In all this Luther could fancy that he was no very indistinct image of his own times. Day after day, Luther returned to the library, took down the old book, devoured some gospel of the New, or story of the Old Testament, rejoicing as one that finds great store of spoil, gazing upon its page, as Columbus may be supposed to have gazed upon the plains and mountains of the New World, when the mists of the ocean opened and unveiled it to him. Meanwhile, a change was passing upon Luther by reading of that book. Other books had developed and strengthened his faculties. This book was awakening new powers within him. The old Luther was passing away. Another Luther was coming into his place. From that moment began those struggles in his soul which were destined never to cease until they issued not merely in a new man, but a new age, a new Europe. Out of the Bible at Oxford came the first dawn of the Reformation. Out of this old Bible at Erfurt came its second morning. It was the year 1503. Luther now took his first academic degree, but his bachelorship in art had nearly cost him his life. So close had been his application to study that he was seized with a dangerous illness, and for some time lay at the point of death. Among others who came to see him was an old priest, who seems to have had a prescience of Luther's future distinction. "My bachelor," said he, "take heart, you shall not die of this sickness. God will make you one who will comfort many others. On those whom he loves, he lays the holy cross, and they who bear it patiently learn wisdom." Luther heard in the words of the aged priest, God calling him back from the grave. He recovered, as had been foretold, and from that hour he carried within him an impression that for some special purpose his life had been prolonged. After an interval of 2 years, he became Master of Arts and Doctor of Philosophy, the laureate of the first scholar at Erfurt University, then the most renowned in Germany, was no unimportant event, and it was celebrated by a torchlight procession. Luther saw that he already had no mean place in the public estimation, and might aspire to the highest honors of the state. As the readiest road to these, he devoted himself, in conformity with his father's wishes, to the bar, and began to give public lectures on the physics and ethics of Aristotle. The old book seems in danger of being forgotten, and the reformer of Christendom of being lost in the wealthy lawyer or the learned judge. But God visited and tried him. 2 incidents that now befell him brought back those feelings and convictions of sin which were beginning to be effaced amid the excitements of his laureate and the fascinations of Aristotle. Again he stood, as it were, on the brink of the eternal world. One morning he was told that his friend Alexius had been overtaken by a sudden and violent death. The intelligence stunned Luther. His companion had fallen, as it were, by the side. Conscience, first quickened by the old Bible, again awoke. Soon after this he paid a visit to his parents at Mansfield. He was returning to Erfurt, and was now near the city gate, when suddenly black clouds gathered overhead, and it began to thunder and lighten in an awful manner. A bolt fell at his feet. Some accounts say that he was thrown down. The great judge, he thought, had descended in this cloud, and he lay momentarily expecting death. In his terror he vowed that should God spare him, he would devote his life to his service. The lightning ceased. The thunders rolled past, and Luther, rising from the ground and pursuing his journey with solemn steps, soon entered the gates of Erfurt. The vow must be fulfilled. To serve God was to wear a monk's hood. so did the age understand it, and so too did Luther. To one so fitted to enjoy the delights of friendship, so able to win the honors of life, nay, with these honors all but already grasped, a terrible wretch it must be to tear himself from the world and enter a monastery, a living grave. But his vow was irrevocable. The greater the sacrifice, the more the merit. He must pacify his conscience, and as yet he knew not of the more excellent way. Once more he will see his friends, and then he prepares a frugal supper. He calls together his acquaintances, and regales them with music. He converses with apparent gaiety. And now the feast is at an end, and the party is broken up. Luther walks straight to the Augustinian convent. On the 17th of August, 1505, he knocks at the gate. The door is opened, and he enters. To Luther, groaning under sin, and seeking deliverance by the works of the law, that monastery, so quiet, so holy, so near to heaven, as he thought, seemed a very paradise. Soon as he had crossed its threshold, the world would be shut out. Sin, too, would be shut out, and that sore trouble of soul which he was enduring would be at an end. At this closed door the avenger would be stayed. So thought Luther as he crossed its threshold. There is a city of refuge to which the sinner may flee when death and hell are on his track. But it is not that into which Luther had now entered. Chapter 3. Luther's life in the convent. Astonishment of his townsmen. Anger of his father. Luther's hopes. Drudgery of the convent. Begs by day, studies by night. Reads Augustine. Studies the Bible. His agony of soul. Needful lessons. When his friends and townsmen learned on the morrow that Luther had taken the cowl, they were struck with stupefaction. That one with such an affluence of all the finer intellectual and social qualities, and to whom his townsmen had already assigned the highest post that genius can fill, should become a monk, seemed a national loss. His friends and many members of the university assembled at the gates of the monastery, and waited there 2 whole days in the hope of seeing Luther, and persuading him to retrace the foolish step which a fit of caprice or a moment's enthusiasm had led him to take. The gate remained closed. Luther came not forth, though the wishes and entreaties of his friends were not unknown to him. What to him were all the rewards of genius, all the posts which the world could offer? The one thing with him was how he might save his soul. Until a month had elapsed, Luther saw no one. When the tidings reached Mansfield, the surprise, disappointment, and rage of Luther's father were great. He had toiled night and day to be able to educate his son. He had seen him win one academic honor after another. Already in imagination he saw him discharging the highest duties and wearing the highest dignities of the state. In a moment all these hopes had been swept away. All had ended in a monk's hood and cowl. John Luther declared that nothing of his should his son ever inherit, and according to some accounts, he set out to Erfurt, and obtaining an interview with his son at the convent gate, asked sharply, how can a son do right in disobeying the counsel of his parents? On a later occasion, when telling his father of the impression made upon his mind by the thunderstorm, and that it was as if a voice from heaven had called him to be a monk, "Take care," was John Luther's reply, "lest you have been imposed upon by an illusion of the devil." On entering the convent, Luther changed his name to Augustine, but in the convent life he did not find that rest and peace to enjoy which he had fled therefor. He was still seeking life, not from Christ, but from monastic holiness. And had he found rest in the convent, he would have missed the eternal rest. It was not long until he was made to feel that he had carried his great burden with him into the monastery, that the apprehensions of wrath which haunted him in the world had followed him there, that in fact the convent bars had shut him in with them, for here his conscience began to thunder more loudly than ever, and his inward torments grew every day more insupportable. Whither shall Luther now flee? He knows no holier place on earth than the cell, and if not there, where shall he find a shadow from this great heat, a rock of shelter from this terrible blast? God was preparing him for being the reformer of Christendom. And the first lesson it was needful to teach him was, what a heavy burden is unpardoned guilt, and what a terrible tormentor is an unawakened conscience, and how impossible it is to find relief from these by works of self-righteousness. From this same burden Luther was to be the instrument of delivering Christendom, and he himself, first of all, must be made to feel how awful its weight is. But let us see what sort of life it is that Luther leads in the monastery of the Augustines. A very different life indeed from that which he had led in the university. The monks, ignorant, lazy, and fond only of good cheer, were incapable of appreciating the character or sympathizing with the tastes of their new brother. That one of the most distinguished doctors of the university should enroll himself in their fraternity was indeed an honor. But did not his fame throw themselves into the shade? Besides, what good would his studies do their monastery? They would replenish neither its wine cellar nor its larder. His brethren found a spiteful pleasure in putting upon him the meanest offices of the establishment. Luther, unrepining, complied. The brilliant scholar of the university had to perform the duties of porter, to open and shut the gates, to wind up the clock, to sweep the church, to clean out the cells. Nor was that the worst. When these tasks were finished, instead of being permitted to retire to his studies, come, would the monks say, get ready your wallet. Away through the town and get us something to eat. The book had to be thrown aside for the bag. It is not by studying, would the friar say, but by baking bread, corn, eggs, fish, meat, and money, that a monk renders himself useful to the cloister. Luther could not but feel the harshness and humiliation of this. The pain must have been exquisite in proportion as his intellect was cultivated, and his tastes refined. But having become a monk, he resolved to go through with it, for how otherwise could he acquire the humility and sanctity he had assumed the habit to learn, and by which he was to earn peace now and life hereafter? No, he must not draw back or shirk either the labor or the shame of the holy monkhood. Accordingly, traversing the streets, wallet on back, the same through which he had strode so often as an honored doctor, or knocking at the door of some former acquaintance or friend and begging alms, might now be seen the monk Augustine. In this kind of drudgery was the day passed. At night, when the other monks were drowned in sleep or in good things which Brother Martin had assisted in begging for them, and when he too, worn out with his many tasks, ought to have laid himself down to rest, instead of seeking his couch, he trimmed his lamp and opened the patristic and scholastic divines. He continued reading them until far into the night. St. Augustine was his especial favorite. In the writings of the Bishop of Hippo, there is more of God's free grace, in contrast with the deep corruption of man, to himself incurable, than in any of the other fathers. And Luther was beginning to feel that the doctrines of Augustine had their echo in his own experience. among the scholastic theologians, Gerson and Occam, whom we have already mentioned as opponents of the Pope's temporal power, were the writers to whom he most frequently turned. But though he set great store on Augustine, there was another book which he prized yet more. This was God's own word, a copy of which he lighted on in the monastery. Oh, how welcome to Luther in this dry, parched land, this well of water, where yet he that drinketh, as said the great teacher, shall never thirst. This Bible he could not take with him to his cell, and there read and study it, for it was chained in the chapel of the convent, but he could and did go to it, and sometimes he spent whole days in meditation upon a single verse or word. It was now that he betook himself to the study of the original tongues, that being able to read the scriptures in the language in which they were at first written, he might see deeper into their meaning. Reuchling's Hebrew lexicon had recently appeared, and with this and other helps he made rapid progress in the knowledge of the Hebrew and Greek. In the ardor of this pursuit, he would forget for weeks together to repeat the daily prayers. His conscience would smite him for transgressing the rules of his order, and he would neither eat nor sleep until, what with the drudgery of the day, the studies of the night, the meager meals he allowed himself, a little bread and a small herring were often his only food. The fasts and macerations he practiced, he was more like a corpse than a taciturn solitary. The person as well as the manners of Luther had undergone a transformation. What with the drudgery of the day, the studies of the night, the meager meals he allowed himself, a little bread and a small herring were often his only food. The fasts and macerations he practiced, he was more like a corpse than a living man. The fire within was still consuming him. He fell sometimes on the floor of his cell in sheer weakness. One morning the door of his cell not being opened as usual, the brethren became alarmed. They knocked. There was no reply. The door was burst in, and poor Fra Martin was found stretched on the ground in a state of ecstasy, scarcely breathing, nearly dead. A monk took his flute, and gently playing upon it one of the airs that Luther loved, brought him gradually back to himself. The likelihood at that moment was that instead of living to do battle with the Pope and pull down the pillars of his kingdom, a quiet grave somewhere in the precincts of the monastery would ere long be the only memorial remaining to testify that such a one as Martin Luther had ever existed. It was indeed a bitter cup that Luther was now drinking, but it could by no means pass from him. He must drink yet deeper. He must drain it to its dregs. Those works which he did in such bondage of spirit were the price with which he thought to buy pardon. The poor monk came again and again with his goodly sum to the door of heaven, only to find it closed. Was it not enough? Shall he take more, thought Luther? He goes back, resumes the sweat of his soul, and in a little while returns with a richer price in his hands. He is again rejected. Alas, the poor monk, what shall he do? He can think but of longer fasts, of severer penances, of more numerous prayers. He returns a third time. Surely he will now be admitted. Alas, no. The sum is yet too small. The door is still shut. Justice demands a still larger price. He returns again and again, and always with a bigger sum in his hand. But the door is not open. God is teaching him that heaven is not to be bought by any sum, however great, that eternal life is the free gift of God. I was indeed a pious monk, he wrote to Duke George of Saxony at a future period of his life, and followed the rules of my order more strictly than I can express. If ever monk could obtain heaven by his monkish works, I should certainly have been entitled to it. Of this all the friars who have known me can testify. If I had continued much longer, I should have carried my mortifications even to death by means of my watching, prayer, reading, and other labors. But the hour is not yet come when Luther was to enjoy peace. Christ and the redemption he had wrought were not yet revealed to him. Until these had been made known, Luther was to find no rest. His anguish continued, nay, increased, and his aspect was now enough to have moved to pity his bitterest enemy. Like a shadow he glided from cell to cell of the monastery, his eyes sunk, his bones protruding, his figure bowed down to the earth. On his brow the shadow of those fierce tempests that were raging in his soul, his tears watering the stony floor, and his bitter cries and deep groans echoing through the long galleries of the convent. A mystery and a terror to the other monks, he tried to disburden his soul to his confessor, an aged monk. He had no experience of such case before. It was beyond his skill. The wound was too deep for him to heal. "Save me in thy righteousness." What does that mean? Asked Luther. I can see how God can condemn me in his righteousness, but how can he save me in his righteousness? But that question his father confessor could not answer. It was well that Luther neither despaired nor abandoned the pursuit as hopeless. He persevered in reading Augustine, and yet more in studying the chained Bible. And it cannot be but that some rays must have broken through his darkness. Why was it that he could not obtain peace? This question he could not but put to himself. What rule of my order have I neglected? Or if in aught have I come short? Have not penance and tears wiped out the fault? And yet my conscience tells me that my sin is not pardoned. Why is this? Are these rules, after all, only the empirical devices of man? Is there no holiness in those works which I am toiling to perform, and those mortifications to which I am submitting? Is it a change of garment only, or a change of heart that I need? Into this train the monk's thoughts could scarce avoid falling, and meanwhile he persevered in the use of those means which have the promise connected to them. Seek, and ye shall find. Knock, and it shall be opened to you. If thou criest after wisdom, if thou liftest up thy voice for understanding, then thou shalt find the fear of the Lord, and understand the knowledge of thy God. It is not Luther alone whose cries we hear. Christendom is groaning in Luther, and travailing in pain to be delivered. The cry of those many captives in all the lands of Christendom, lying in fetters, goes up in the cry of this captive, and has entered into the ears of the great ruler. Already a deliverer is on the road. As Luther, hour by hour, is sinking in the abyss, nearer hour by hour are the approaching footsteps of the man who is to aid him in breaking the bars of his own and the world's prison. And we will pick up right here next time. We're looking at our next chapter. Chapter 4, Luther, the monk, becomes Luther, the reformer. So be sure to come back. May the Almighty bless you all and keep you as you travel on the narrow way that leads to life. I will see you next time. Be informed, edified, and grow in the faith as your spirit is daily nourished in a biblical worldview, because you love the truth. FirstAmendmentRadio.net/MOPI. Faith comes by hearing, and hearing by the Word of God. Always listenable, at work or on the go. FirstAmendmentRadio.net/MOBI. No download or app necessary.